Prepare yourself for a journey back to the tumultuous 11th century, where we will delve into the remarkable life and tragic end of Harold Godwinson, better known as Harold II, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon King of England. His story is one of a man born into immense power and influence who rose to the pinnacle of a crumbling kingdom only to meet his fate on a hill in Sussex, forever etched into the annals of history by the Norman conquest. Harold's life began around the year 1022, a time when England was still reeling from decades of Danish rule and the recent restoration of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy under Canute the Great's successor. He was born into the wealthiest and most powerful family in England, second only to the royal house itself, the House of Godwin. His father was Godwin, Earl of Wessex, a man of immense political skill and cunning who had risen from relatively humble origins to become the most influential magnate in the kingdom. His mother was a Danish noblewoman related to King Canute, which further solidified the family's aristocratic standing and provided important connections to the Scandinavian world. Harold was not Godwin's eldest son, but eventually the most distinguished. He had several brothers and sisters, all of whom would play significant roles in the political landscape of 11th century England. Among his brothers were Sweyn, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. His sisters included Edith of Wessex, who would marry King Edward the Confessor, a testament to the Godwin family's strategic marriage alliances and their entrenchment within the royal family. From an early age, Harold would have been immersed in the intricacies of Anglo-Saxon courtly life, a world of shifting alliances, political manoeuvring, and military training. He would have been educated in the martial arts, learning to ride, fight, and command, skills essential for a nobleman of his standing. Beyond a physical prowess, he would have been exposed to the administrative and legal systems of the kingdom, an understanding crucial for his future responsibilities. The Godwin family's vast landholdings and extensive networks of retainers would have provided Harold with a deep understanding of governance at both local and national levels. His father, Godwin, served as the primary example and teacher. Godwin's career was a masterclass in political survival and ascent, marked by periods of both immense favour and grave exile. Harold would have witnessed firsthand the precarious nature of power and the constant threat of rivals, an invaluable lesson that would prepare him for the challenges he would face. The young Harold, growing up in such an environment, would have absorbed the lessons of leadership, strategy, and diplomacy from the most powerful man in England, shaping him into the formidable figure he would become. Harold Godwinson's true ascent to political prominence began during the reign of King Edward the Confessor, his brother-in-law. Edward, who had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, returned to England in 1041 and was crowned king in 1042. He owed much of his initial support to the powerful Godwin family, and, in particular, to Harold's father, Godwin of Wessex. Initially, the relationship between the king and the Godwins was one of mutual reliance. Godwin, the preeminent magnate, provided the stability and military strength Edward needed to assert his authority after 2 decades of Danish rule. In return, the Godwins saw their influence expand further. Harold himself, still relatively young, began to acquire lands and influence, initially serving as a prominent member of his father's retinue and increasingly taking on responsibilities within the Witan, the Anglo-Saxon Royal Council. However, Edward's Norman sympathies, cultivated during his long exile, soon began to cause friction with the English aristocracy, most notably with his sons. Edward surrounded himself with Norman advisors, granting them important ecclesiastical and secular positions, which alienated many of the traditional Anglo-Saxon magnates. This tension reached a boiling point in 1051. The catalyst was a violent incident in Dover involving Count Eustace II of Boulogne, a royal favourite. Edward demanded that Godwin punish the town, but Godwin refused, sensing an opportunity to challenge the king's pro-Norman tendencies. His defiance led to a direct confrontation. Edward, with the support of other powerful earls like Earl Siward of Northumbria and Earl Leofric of Mercia, moved against the Godwins. Harold, along with his father and brothers, was declared an outlaw and forced into exile. Harold and his brother Leofwine fled to Ireland, while Godwin and his other sons sought refuge in Flanders. This period of exile, though brief, was a crucial turning point. It highlighted the fragility of even the Godwins' immense power and forced them to re-evaluate their strategies. Harold, during his time in Ireland, was not idle. He quickly gathered a small fleet and assembled a force of Irish and English mercenaries. Simultaneously, his father Godwin was preparing to invade from Flanders. In 1052, barely a year after their exile, the Godwins launched a coordinated invasion of England. Harold sailed up the Bristol Channel, wreaking havoc and gathering support, while Godwin sailed up the Thames, securing London. The populace largely rallied to their cause, weary of the king's foreign favourites and perhaps seeing the Godwins as champions of English interests. Faced with overwhelming support for the returning exiles and a lack of support from his own nobility, King Edward was forced to capitulate. The Godwins were restored to their lands and titles, and the Norman influence at court was significantly curtailed. This dramatic reinstatement solidified Harold's position. Following his father's death in 1053, Harold inherited the immensely powerful earldom of Wessex, making him the wealthiest and most influential nobleman in England. He effectively became the king's chief minister, managing the affairs of the realm and leading military campaigns. He was now, without question, the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Harold's administrative skills were evident in his governance of Wessex, but his military prowess was also repeatedly tested. He led a series of successful campaigns against Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the king of Gwynedd, who had united much of Wales and was frequently raiding English territory. These campaigns, often conducted under harsh winter conditions, showcased Harold's determination and tactical acumen. In 1063, a particularly brutal campaign culminated in the death of Gruffydd, a significant victory that brought an end to decades of Welsh incursions and secured England's western borders. These victories greatly enhanced Harold's reputation, further solidifying his image as a strong and capable leader capable of defending the realm. By the early 1060s, Harold was not just a powerful earl, he was almost a co-ruler. King Edward, increasingly frail and pious, relied heavily on Harold for the day-to-day governance of the kingdom. Harold essentially became the de facto regent, undertaking diplomatic missions, presiding over the Witan and leading military campaigns. His brothers also held significant earldoms: Gurth in East Anglia, Leofwine in Kent, and Tostig in Northumbria, further ensuring Godwin family dominance throughout England. This established power base, combined with his proven leadership and military success, made Harold the natural successor to the childless Edward. One of the most debated and historically significant events in Harold Godwinson's life, and indeed in the lead-up to the Norman conquest, is his alleged trip to Normandy. emphasized in the Bayeux Tapestry, a partisan source commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, to justify the Norman conquest. The precise date and circumstances of Harold's journey to Normandy are a matter of historical contention. The Bayeux Tapestry dates it to 1064, but some historians argue for 1065 or even earlier. The reason for the journey is also debated. The Norman version, championed by the tapestry, claims Harold was sent by King Edward to formally confirm William as Edward's heir to the English throne. This narrative serves to legitimize William's later invasion. However, Anglo-Saxon sources are silent on such a mission, and it seems highly improbable that Edward, who was surrounded by numerous Anglo-Saxon magnates and had no direct authority over Harold's actions abroad, would send his most influential earl on such a vital diplomatic mission. A more plausible explanation, widely accepted by many historians, is that Harold's trip was accidental. It is believed that a storm at sea drove his ship off course, leading him to land on the coast of Ponthieu, a Norman vassal state. According to the customs of the time, anyone shipwrecked on foreign shores was subject to arrest and ransom, as Harold was captured by Guy I, Count of Ponthieu, who saw an opportunity to extract a large ransom. Upon hearing of Harold's capture, William, Duke of Normandy, swiftly intervened. He demanded that Guy release Harold into his custody, promising a generous payment in return. William, savvy and ambitious, recognized the immense political leverage that holding Harold, the most powerful man in England, would provide. Harold was subsequently brought to William's court. While at William's court, Harold was treated with a deceptive cordiality. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts Harold being honoured, participating in William's military campaigns, notably against Conan II of Brittany, and receiving arms from William, implying a vassal-like relationship. It also famously shows Harold saving 2 Norman soldiers from quicksand, an act of chivalry that further highlights his martial prowess, even for a Norman audience. It was during this period that the infamous oath allegedly took place. The Bayeux Tapestry vividly portrays Harold swearing an oath on holy relics to William. The exact content of this oath is, of course, presented through the Norman lens. Norman accounts following the tapestry claim Harold swore to support William's claim to the English throne and aid him in securing it upon Edward's death. This oath was absolutely crucial for William. In an age of deeply held religious belief, breaking such an oath sworn on holy relics was considered a grave sin, a betrayal of God himself. William would later use this alleged oath as his primary justification for invading England in 1066. From Harold's perspective, the circumstances were undoubtedly coercive. He was a captive, albeit a well-treated one, in a foreign land. It is highly probable that he saw the oath as a means to secure his release and return to England, a pragmatic decision under duress, rather than a sincere promise of fealty. He was under immense pressure, surrounded by William's powerful court, and likely understood that refusal could lead to prolonged imprisonment or even death. He may have made a mental reservation, intending to disregard the oath once he was back on English soil, where he held the true power. Such a Machiavellian approach would not have been uncommon in the cutthroat politics of the 11th century. It's also possible that the oath was far less specific than Norman accounts suggest. Perhaps it was a general oath of friendship or assistance, later twisting by William's propagandists to serve his agenda. The fact that the relics were hidden under also suggest that Harold was unaware of their presence, thus arguably invalidating the oath from a theological standpoint. The immediate consequence of this episode was Harold's eventual return to England. William, having extracted his promise, allowed Harold to depart, perhaps believing he had secured his claim. However, Harold's priority was always the stability and continuity of the English Anglo-Saxon monarchy. He returned to a kingdom where King Edward was aging and the succession was becoming an increasingly pressing issue. His journey to Normandy, whether accidental or not, and the subsequent oath, would become a central pillar of William's propaganda, shaping the narrative of the Norman conquest for centuries to come. It would paint Harold as a perjurer, a betrayer of his word, and thus justify William's invasion as a righteous crusade. The last years of King Edward the Confessor's reign were increasingly dominated by concerns over the succession. Edward was childless, and by the mid-1060s was an old and increasingly frail man. England faced a crisis, a monarchy without a clear heir. Several claimants emerged, each with varying degrees of legitimacy and ambition. Chief among these claimants were, first and foremost, Harold Godwinson himself. As the most powerful man in England, a proven military leader, and King Edward's brother-in-law, Harold was the natural choice of the English magnates. He had effectively been running the kingdom for years and was deeply embedded within the Anglo-Saxon noble traditions. Another significant claimant was William, Duke of Normandy. He based his claim on a purported promise from King Edward made during Edward's exile in Normandy that William would be his successor. This claim was tenuous at best, as the English throne was not Edward's to bestow like a personal possession. Succession was determined by the Witan, the council of leading English noblemen and clergy. William also leveraged Harold's alleged oath to bolster his claim. A third contender was Edgar Etheling, the grandson of King Edmund Ironside and the last surviving male member of the royal house of Wessex. Edgar was undeniably of royal blood, but he was young and had spent most of his life in exile, lacking the powerful support base and political experience needed to secure the throne. His claim was based purely on bloodline. Finally, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, also had a claim, based on an old agreement between his predecessor, Magnus the Good, and the earlier Danish king Harthacnut, that if either died without an heir, the other would inherit both kingdoms. This was a long-shot claim, but one that Hardrada was determined to press. The succession crisis came to a head in late 1065. King Edward's health rapidly deteriorated, and he entered into his final illness. Sources suggest that during his last days, Edward consecrated Westminster Abbey, his great architectural achievement, on December 28th, but was too weak to attend the ceremony. He lingered for a few more days, and then, on January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. His death plunged England into immediate constitutional crisis. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, the Witan formally elected the new king, though usually from within the royal house. However, with Edward childless and Edgar Etheling too young and lacking support, the Witan faced a difficult decision. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary source, states that King Edward died on the 5th day of January and Harold Earl was consecrated king, and he endured thereafter but a short time. This simple statement belies the urgency of the situation. Within hours of Edward's death, the Witan met. The immediate threat of invasion, particularly from William of Normandy, was palpable. England needed a strong, experienced leader, and quickly. Harold Godwinson Godwinson was the obvious and pragmatic choice. He was the most powerful and popular nobleman in the kingdom, already effectively governing the country, and he had a proven track record of military success and administrative capability. His brothers controlled key earldoms, ensuring a united front among the English aristocracy. Crucially, he was present in Westminster at the time of Edward's death, allowing for a swift and decisive coronation. On January 6, 1066, the very day after Edward's death, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. This incredibly rapid succession was unprecedented and underscored the desperate need for stability in the face of imminent threats. The speed of the coronation was later used by Norman propagandists to suggest usurpation, but it was in fact a testament to the urgency and the Witan's belief that Harold was the only man capable of defending the kingdom. The coronation ceremony itself was a deeply symbolic and religiously significant event. Harold would have been anointed with holy oil, presented with the royal regalia, the crown, scepter, and orb, and sworn an oath to uphold justice and protect the church. This sacred ritual transformed Harold from a powerful earl into the divinely appointed monarch of England. Harold's reign, however, would be tragically short, lasting less than 10 months. From the moment he ascended the throne, he was besieged by external threats. William of Normandy immediately reacted to the news of Harold's coronation with outrage, viewing it as a breach of Harold's oath and a personal insult. He began to prepare for invasion, meticulously gathering ships, men, and papal support for his venture. But William was not the only threat. Harold's own contentious brother Tostig, whom Harold had exiled from his earldom of Northumbria in 1065 due to his tyrannical rule, was also plotting. Tostig, seeking revenge and restoration, would soon align himself with a formidable ally, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who also laid claim to the English throne. Harold II, the newly crowned king, faced a two-pronged invasion from the north and the south, a challenge that no English monarch had ever faced before. His reign would be a desperate struggle for survival, both for himself and for the Anglo-Saxon kingdom he now ruled. No sooner had Harold II been crowned king than he faced the immediate and severe challenge of defending his realm. The year 1066 would prove to be one of the most tumultuous in English history, a year of relentless campaigning and ultimate tragedy for the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. The first major threat materialized from the north, orchestrated by Harold's own estranged and vindictive brother, Tostig Godwinson. Tostig, stripped of his earldom of Northumbria by a revolt in 1065, which Harold had supported to maintain stability, was now a bitter exile. He sought to reclaim his lands and exact revenge on his brother. After initial raiding attempts along the English coast proved unsuccessful, Tostig turned to more formidable allies. He first sought aid from William of Normandy, but failing to secure a definite commitment, he looked further north. Tostig found a willing and powerful partner in Harold Hardrada, the imposing King of Norway, often referred to as the last great Viking. Hardrada, a legendary warrior and adventurer who had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople before becoming king, held a claim to the English throne through an old dynastic agreement. He saw Tostig's knowledge and desire for revenge as a perfect opportunity to press his own ambitions. The two formed a powerful, if opportunistic, alliance. The scale of the Norwegian invasion was immense. In September 1066, a massive massive fleet of over 300 long ships carrying perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 warriors sailed from Norway, making its way down the coast of Scotland and then into the Humber estuary. This was a full-scale invasion, aiming not for plunder, but for conquest. Upon landing, Hardrada and Tostig swiftly marched inland. They were met by the forces of the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, Edwin and Morcar, who held responsibility for defending the north. On September 20th, 1066, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Fulford Gate just south of York. The English forces, though brave, were significantly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle was a decisive victory for the Norwegians, who inflicted heavy casualties, scattering the English defenders and forcing Edwin and Morcar to flee. York, the most important city in the north, surrendered to Hardrada. News of the northern invasion reached King Harold II, who was at this time in the south, likely around London or the Isle of Wight, anxiously awaiting and preparing for William's invasion from Normandy. Harold had wisely assembled his Verd, the national militia, along the southern coast in anticipation of a Norman landing. However, the unexpected and overwhelming scale of the Norwegian invasion in the north forced him to make a critical strategic decision. He could not allow Hardrada to consolidate his hold over the north of England. Harold II demonstrated remarkable speed and determination. Gathering his horse guards, his elite professional bodyguard, and drawing on furred contingents from the Midlands, he embarked on one of the most astonishing forced marches in medieval military history. Covering approximately 185 miles, around 300 kilometers, in just 4 days, Harold's army moved with incredible swiftness, traversing difficult terrain and arriving in the vicinity of York on September 25th, completely taking the invading Norwegians by surprise. Hardrada and Tostig, believing the local English forces crushed and unaware of Harold's rapid approach, had dispersed some of their troops and were positioned at Stamford Bridge, a crossing point over the River Derwent, waiting for hostages and supplies from York. It was here, on September 25th, 1066, that the Battle of Stamford Bridge unfolded. The battle was fierce and bloody. The element of surprise was critical for Harold. The Norwegians were caught off guard, many without their full armour. What followed was a brutal and prolonged fight. A legendary stand was made by a single Norseman who held the bridge against the English advance, allegedly killing 40 Englishmen before being dispatched. When the English finally crossed, the full force of Harold's disciplined horse guards, hardened by years of campaigning, clashed with the seasoned Viking warriors. The turning point came when both Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson were killed. Hardrada fell early in the battle, possibly by an arrow to the throat. Tostig, fighting valiantly, was also slain. With their leaders dead, and facing relentless pressure from Harold's forces, the Norwegian army broke and fled. The victory was total and overwhelming for Harold. The Norwegian invasion was crushed, their great fleet mostly captured or destroyed, and the threat from the north extinguished. Stamford Bridge was a magnificent triumph for Harold II, showcasing his military genius, his decisiveness, and the loyalty of his troops. He had successfully defended his kingdom against a formidable combined force, confirming his reputation as a great warrior king. However, this hard-won victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's army was exhausted, depleted, and many of his elite horse guards had been killed or wounded. These These were the very men he would desperately need in just a few days, for news was about to arrive that would force him into yet another, even more desperate confrontation. The euphoria of victory at Stamford Bridge was tragically short-lived. Barely 3 days after his monumental triumph in the north, exhausted from the forced march and the brutal battle, King Harold II received intelligence that would seal his fate and fundamentally alter the course of English history. William, Duke of Normandy, had finally landed his invasion fleet on the soft beaches of Pevensey Bay, Sussex, on September the 28th, 1066. William's invasion had been stalled for weeks by unfavourable winds, leading Harold to disband some of his third in the south, believing the campaigning season was over. When the winds finally shifted, William seized the opportunity. His force, estimated to be between 7,000 and 10,000 men, a mix of Norman knights, archers and infantry, along with mercenaries and adventurers from throughout France, disembarked unopposed. William immediately fortified a camp at Hastings and began to plunder the surrounding countryside, a clear provocation designed to draw Harold south. Upon receiving the devastating news, Harold faced an agonizing dilemma. His army, though victorious, was severely depleted and exhausted. His best fighters, the Horse Guards, had fought 2 major engagements in quick succession. His only option was another forced march, this time back south, to confront William before the Normans could consolidate their position. Refusing to wait for reinforcements from the more distant parts of his kingdom, Harold made the fateful decision to march immediately. He rode from York to London in an astonishing 5 days, arriving around October 5th or 6th, and paused only briefly to gather what fresh troops he could and reorganize his battered forces. On October 13th, Harold's army arrived on Senlac Hill, now known as Battle, just 6 miles north of Hastings. It was a strong defensive position, a ridge with gradual slopes on either side, offering a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Harold, a skilled tactician, massed his troops at the top of the ridge pass, forming a dense defensive shield wall consisting primarily of his elite horse guards and the third armed with axes, spears and shields. This formation was designed to withstand cavalry charges and was incredibly effective in defensive warfare. The following morning, Saturday, October 14th, 1066, William of Normandy marched his forces up to the base of Senlac Hill. The Norman army was composed of 3 main divisions: archers and crossbowmen in the front, followed by heavily armed infantry, and finally the formidable Norman cavalry, which would be the decisive arm in the battle. The Battle of Hastings began around 9 a.m. William's archers opened the engagement, but their arrows largely bounced off the tight shield wall or flew harmlessly over it. The Norman infantry then advanced, attempting to break the English line, but they too were repelled by the disciplined shield wall and the ferocious swinging axes of the Horse Guards. The pivotal actions of the battle revolved around the Norman cavalry. Repeatedly, the Norman knights charged up the hill, only to be met by the unbreakable English formation. Frustration began to set in among the Normans. At one point, a rumour spread that William himself had been killed, causing panic within his ranks. William famously rode among his troops, raising his helmet to show he was alive, rallying them and preventing a rout. It was during these repeated charges that the Normans employed a crucial tactic, whether by design or accident: the feigned retreat. Several times, detachments of Norman cavalry would charge, then suddenly turn and pretend to flee. Several English ferdmen, eager to pursue and finish off the retreating enemy, broke ranks and charged down the hill. The Norman cavalry would then suddenly turn and cut down the pursuing English who had left the safety of the shield wall. This tactic, repeated numerous times over the long hours of the battle, slowly but surely began to erode the integrity of Harold's formation. Each time a section of the shield wall broke, it created a vulnerability that the Norman knights could exploit. The English, despite their bravery, were exhausted, lacking the flexibility of the Norman heavy cavalry to counter such fluid movements. The battle raged for most of the day, an incredibly long engagement for the medieval period. The English fought with fierce determination, defending their homeland. However, as evening approached, the attrition became too great. The shield wall was thinned, gaps appeared, and the discipline that had held it together began to waver. The exact circumstances of King Harold II's death are debated by historians, largely due to conflicting accounts and the partisan nature of sources like the Bayeux Tapestry. The tapestry famously depicts Harold being struck in the eye by an arrow, then cut down by several Norman knights. Other accounts suggest he was simply overwhelmed by a group of knights in the thick of the fighting. What is certain is that Harold, fighting at the heart of his army, leading from the front, met his end on Senlac Hill. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, also died fighting alongside him. With their king and leaders fallen, the remaining English forces, now leaderless and fragmented, finally broke and fled. The Battle of Hastings was a catastrophic defeat for the Anglo-Saxons and a decisive victory for William. It marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and ushered in a new Norman era. The body of King Harold was reportedly so mutilated that it could only be recognized by his mistress, Edith Swan Neck, by secret marks on his body. William initially ordered his body buried anonymously, and later allowed it to be buried at Waltham Abbey, a monastery Harold himself had founded. The legacy of Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king, would forever be intertwined with his heroic yet ultimately futile stand at Hastings. The life and death of Harold Godwinson, King Harold II, represent a pivotal moment in English history, marking the dramatic end of the Anglo-Saxon era and the beginning of Norman rule. His brief reign of less than 10 months was a testament to his courage, his strategic acumen, and his unwavering dedication to his kingdom even in the face of insurmountable odds. Harold's legacy is complex and has been viewed differently throughout history. For centuries following the conquest, Norman chroniclers, seeking to legitimize William's conquest, portrayed Harold as a usurper, a perjurer who had broken a sacred oath, and a faithless king who justly met his end. This narrative, reinforced by sources like the Bayeux Tapestry, dominated historical memory for a long time. However, in more recent times, Harold's reputation has been largely rehabilitated. Modern historians recognize him as a strong and capable ruler, a skilled warrior, and an ambitious but ultimately patriotic leader. He inherited a kingdom fraught with internal rivalries and external threats, and he tackled these challenges with formidable energy. His rapid response to the Norwegian invasion, his decisive victory at Stamford Bridge, and his willingness to immediately march south to confront William demonstrate a leader of exceptional military talent and steadfast resolve. Harold was not a flawless figure. His ambition was undeniable, and his handling of his brother Tostig contributed to some of the internal discord he faced. Yet, when the ultimate crisis arrived, he did not flinch. He personally led his forces, fought at the forefront of the battle, and died defending his crown and his people. He embodies the Anglo-Saxon ideal of a warrior king intimately involved in the defense of his realm. His death at the Battle of Hastings was not merely the end of a king, but the end of an entire social, political, and cultural order. The Norman conquest brought profound changes to England. The replacement of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman lords, the imposition of the French language in government and law, significant architectural and artistic shifts, and a reorientation of England's political and cultural ties towards continental Europe. The familiar, ancient institutions of Anglo-Saxon England, though not entirely dismantled, were profoundly reshaped by the new regime. Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king, remains a tragic yet heroic figure. His story is a poignant reminder of the vagaries of fate and the immense weight of leadership. He stood as the final bulwark against a transformative invasion, and though he ultimately failed to stem the tide, his valiant struggle left an indelible mark on the national consciousness. He is remembered as the king who fought to the very end for his kingdom, paying the ultimate price on the field of battle, securing his place not just as a king, but as a symbol of Anglo-Saxon defiance against overwhelming odds. His legacy is one of courage, sacrifice, and the final glorious stand of an ancient kingdom.